Hi, my name is Darby. I was the only child of my parents, Mr. and Mrs. Brown. I used to think that the world was a magical place, and my life was an endless party. My parents were very rich and I never wondered where it all came from. I adored my parents so much and they always pampered me like a princess and never refused me anything. I never wondered what my parents do for a living, until one day it was too late. One Sunday night, my parents threw a ball party. I went out onto the balcony of our huge house and watched as more and more guests arrived for the party. Suddenly, a fire broke out in the house and spread very strongly. People barely had time to run out of the house that night. I thought for the first time that my parents had enemies, or they themselves were someone's enemies. In an instant, my parents brought out a gun and I was shocked. I didn't have time to ask my parents what they were doing with a gun and what was going on. My father immediately ordered my nanny, Mrs. Jane, to take me away from the burning house. Mrs. Jane immediately grabbed me in her arms and rushed away, passing the burning area of the house. Mrs. Jane managed to save me, but it was all over for my parents that day. I felt pain beyond bearing and tears didn't stop flowing. I couldn't believe what just happened. I cried my eyes out and I felt lost. My nanny, Mrs. Jane, tried to console me, but I couldn't help it. I felt like my world just crashing down on me. Mrs. Jane asked me to follow her and promised to take care of me. Mrs. Jane assured me that she was going to train me to be strong and even stronger than my parents. At the same time, my nanny promised to train and teach me to protect the children like me. At first, I didn't quite understand what my nanny meant because I just lost my parents and was left alone. But I then realized that there was no need for me to feel hopeless, and I have always trusted Mrs. Jane, so I agreed to become her student. 8 years later, Darby spent the next 8 years in an elite nanny academy. The location, which was classified, Mrs. Jane has kept her promise and raised Darby, and now she felt much stronger. After these years, Mrs. Jane became the headmistress of Elite Nanny Academy, which even pleased Darby. After numerous lessons and training, Darby was ready to take her first serious task. Shortly before her visit to the director, Darby was talking about a generous offer with a certain Mr. Lucas. The headmistress promised that with such a salary, they would be able to provide the best employees with many years of experience. But Mr. Lucas needed a special worker who had never worked with anyone before. Mrs. Jane, the headmistress, took out a list of employees who were in line for the first task and presented it to the client. Mr. Lucas wondered if all these people whose names were on the list were competent. The headmistress vouched that all their graduates were proficient in all the basic skills. They were all very well versed in early childhood development and psychology. It was also important for the employees to know how to perform first aid to the victims. Self-defense was also taught here, so that the employees had the opportunity to protect the child at the right time. It was considered important that all employees knew how to drive a car and other vehicles well. Cybersecurity was also given great importance, so employees were trained in computer science. Mrs. Jane also named the qualities of housekeeping, financial planning, politics, and more. The headmistress asked Mr. Lucas why he needed an elite nanny. Mr. Lucas explained that the mother of his son was late, and he needed someone to take care of his son. Jane assured him that his child was in good hands. Jane then asked if he wanted to choose someone in particular. Lucas began to look at the folders with the files of the employees, but he did not dwell on them for too long. Very soon, he pointed to Darby's resume and demanded that this particular girl be given to raise his son. However, Darby's specialty was in cybersecurity, and the headmistress asked if he had a large internet at home. Having received a negative answer, Jane stated that in such a case she couldn't recommend the employee. Instead, she offered him another resume. Well, but Mr. Lucas didn't want to listen any further and repeated again that he wanted to hire Darby. The headmistress looked at the client with some reproach, but still, she couldn't refuse him because he paid well. Soon Jane called Darby to her office Not too long Darby appeared at Jane's office. Darby was worried because this was her first task, but she believed that she would succeed. Darby entered the office and saw that Mrs. Jane was standing with her back to her and was in no hurry to turn. Jane notified Darby that she has been offered a task today. Darby managed to rejoice without hesitation and cried out that she was completely ready. Jane went to her desk and took out a folder, briefly told Darby that her employer's name was Mr. Javier Lucas. Hearing the name, Darby was puzzled because she knew the name very well. Darby remembered a headline on the front page of the news that said, Javier had been hit back. It was a mafia family which, according to Darby, was involved in the fire in her house 8 years ago. Jane immediately advised her not to accept this task because, although she had passed it on Darby, she also has the right to refuse. But Darby couldn't refuse the first task after everything that her former nanny, Mrs. Jane, has done for her. At the same time, the memories of the past flooded back to her, and she still do not understand why they did this. Up until this time, Darby had thought that she would never get an answer, but now she saw that she had a chance. Without hesitation, Darby declared that she was ready to accept the assignment and proceed immediately. The headmistress herself doubted that it was worth accepting the job because of Darby's past, but that was why Darby agreed for the job. Darby also thought about the fact that Mr. Lucas had a small child, and since the child needs protection, she was ready to provide it. In addition, Darby hoped to find out the truth about what happened on that tragic day. After that, Jane met Mr. Lucas again, and the only thing that interested him was whether Darby had signed the contract or not. The headmistress confirmed, and Darby herself had already managed to pack her suitcase and was ready to go with her employer. As soon as Darby appeared on the doorstep, Jane herself introduced Darby to the person for whom she would work. She called his name in full, while he stood a little aside as if he did not want to communicate with the future nanny. However, he turned, and now Darby could see the man with whom she would have to work for. Lucas was very young and handsome, which Darby did not expect, and even forgot that she needed to say hello. Mr. Lucas decided to break the silence and introduced himself, and she immediately stretched out her hands and introduced herself. Darby said to Mr. Lucas that she was pleased to meet and work for him, to which he reciprocated. After that, Lucas asked Darby to go sit in the car when she was ready to go. While he was gone, Jane decided to briefly repeat with Darby the duties that she would have to perform. The headmistress also reminded Darby that she shouldn't reveal secrets and also not to put the boss in an awkward position. Darby promised that she would not let her mentor down. Darby was sure that she could cope with everything and was already proud of herself in advance. With a clear conscience, Darby bid her mentor farewell and went to the car. Mr. Javier Lucas was a very young man and devilishly handsome. He had a little long silver hair, his Roman nose and half-dome cheekbones set above an oaken jaw. His wrestler's shoulders were part of his burly physique. He walked with a tiger-like tread and his dark brown eyes twinkled. His daring-do personality and bass voice were a big part of his ambitious characteristics. He was the head of the famous mafia gang called Javier Gang. He was a very ruthless man and doesn't take no for an answer. Mr. Lucas was in the car with his son Mike. As he waits for the new nanny to get in the car, Mr. Lucas' driver, Adam, helped Darby with her suitcase. Darby went and sat in the car and noticed that Mr. Lucas' son was sitting beside his father. Unexpected for her, still she pulled herself together and immediately spoke to the boy, immediately clarifying whether he was Lucas's son. The kid began to introduce himself as Mike, but his father interrupted him and added that everyone just called him Mikey. Darby did not forget about politeness and expressed how pleased she was to meet the boy. Mikey then told his father that Darby smelled like oranges. Darby didn't understand why the boy said that, and even sniffed herself discreetly to see if she really smelled like that. After that, Darby asked Mr. Lucas where they were going. Mikey decided to get ahead of his father and gave out that they were going to a large mansion in the city for commoners. Lucas decided to correct his son's words a little and explained that they had recently moved from the south of the country. Darby thought it was far away, that they decided to move to Chicago, and immediately took out her laptop. Lucas noticed Darby with her laptop and told her that there was Wi-Fi in car if she needed it.